Test optional changed a lot of things, and that term gets thrown around a lot. Not everybody knows exactly what all the test terms are and how they interplay with college admissions. So when we talk about test blind, there are a few. All right, so you may be asking at this point, is standardized testing right for my child? And only you can determine that. I would say take their age into account. Most research that I've seen indicates that testing is pretty futile prior to about grade 3. Starting around grade 3 would be the first time that any kind of formal standardized testing would produce any sort of accuracy in its results, okay? I'm sure part of that is due to reading level of the students and, what they can be expected to process, how long they can focus, but for whatever reason, there are tests out there for younger kids. Most students are not going to really be set up well for testing until at least 3rd grade. So keep that in mind. Is your 3rd grader ready? Well, again, that's more of your call. There are emotional considerations, right? If your student has maybe just come out of a public school environment and they were really, pretty distraught over the testing environment that had been created, you may need to take a year or 2 before you administer a test. And you may need to kind of completely change the narrative around school and education and what this looks like. Sometimes we talk about deschooling the first year out of a public school environment. Take that into consideration. Is my student ready to kind of change the narrative related to testing? If they can't let that go, I would say wait a year or 2 and really kind of change that narrative before you introduce testing again. There are other considerations. If your student is really anxious, really nervous about things in general, maybe you want to wait until that's a little better under control before you do something where you can't immediately answer all of their questions for them. So sometimes maturity, it may be due to even what accommodations and things they might need and how effectively they could work independently. So there are a lot of reasons that you can consider this. I would say that most students should eventually take some sort of test because most likely in life, they're going to have to take one at some point. But whether or not you choose to start when they're 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, there are a lot of factors there that parents are going to be able to make the best decision about. So let's say that you've decided, I think we can test. I think this could be useful. This could be a skill that my kid needs at some point down the road. So we want to take the stigma away from it. We want to make it just kind of normal so that they're not stressed. So how do I go about choosing an assessment? So I would say, first of all, what does it assess? So in looking at the testing options that are out there, you're going to find some that test just foundational skills, reading, writing, and arithmetic kind of thing. Like if you think about it that way, right? What are the foundational skills that everybody needs? And then there are others that really cover a specific scope and sequence. And this is what I found to be true of most elementary, most exams that were geared for elementary students. The problem is most exams are created for publicly educated students, and they do follow a Common Core or a public school scope and sequence. And so that can be a little challenging to navigate. Do you just administer certain sections of it? Is that allowed within that assessment? These are kinds of questions that you need to consider and ask and do some research on as you're looking at what those options are. But those that test foundational skills, if we talk about reading, language arts, basically language arts and mathematics, those are going to be pretty consistent across the board. So when you can find an assessment that does primarily that may be a better fit for a homeschooled student if you're not following a traditional public school scope and sequence. What this looked like when my kids were younger, we lived in a state that did have end-of-year testing requirements. And so we would administer one of those tests. I think I did the Iowa's some years, I did the Stanford's other years. And I would kind of tease through the results and say, this one's about reading. Yeah, I care about that one. This one's about, grammar and writing. I care about that. I care about math. Social studies, we did ancient history this year and they were tested on civics. So yeah, they got okay because we talk, they have some knowledge of civics, but like we were studying the pyramids and ancient Greece and whatever. We were not talking about civics this year. So I don't really care about their social studies results. They were tested on something that we didn't cover. And so just be aware of that. Like I would kind of go through the results and go, I care about this, I care about this, I don't care about this. So you can do that, or some exams allow you to just administer sections of it. And then there are options out there for those that just cover those foundational skills. CLT is currently developing grades 3 through 6 testing. We are pilot testing that this spring, should be available in 2024. And it is just language, arts, and math, because we design tests to be done by students who are not in a public school environment. It's really kind of curriculum neutral, what we do. So we just look at those foundational skills, but you can find some other assessments out there that do that as well. The other thing to look at is timed versus untimed. There are standardized tests out there that are untimed, and that can be great for the elementary years, especially if you just want information about like, where are my kids' strengths? What do we still need to work on? And you don't want the timing element to factor into those results, then those untimed tests can be really helpful. As they get closer to high school, I would encourage you to at least experiment with some timed tests, because that is going to be a factor if they're looking at the ASVAB, a college entrance exam, anything like that. There are timed components to that. So I would say introduce timing at some point, but there are elementary options out there that are untimed. Look at the duration. Is it going to take you 8 hours to administer this whole exam? Do you have 8 hours to give to it? Are you looking for a test that's going to be done in 2 hours that you can break up over a couple of days? These are important considerations and things that you need to be on the look for when you are assessing which exam will I use. Proctor requirements come into play. These differ from one test manufacturer to the next. I know some of them you had to have a college degree to administer. Some of them, it was just a high school degree. Some allow you to administer to relatives, others don't. I think it was the Stanfords that I had to go through a process. And because I had a background in occupational therapy and I had been trained in administering assessments, I was certified to teach a Stanford, but I had to get approval to administer the Stanford, even to my own children. And they wouldn't do that just with like a bachelor's degree. Like you had to have additional like qualifications in order to do that. So not all assessments are available to all parents to administer. So just keep that in mind and make sure that that's one of the things that you're researching. And then also look, what kinds of results and analytics are you going to get? Are they going to be helpful to you? Will they really help you direct your students' education? Because again, we don't want to do this just to check off a box. This ought to be directing our education and really saying like, oh, my kid is really good in this area. We probably ought to foster that in some ways. We need to look for ways that we can really challenge them and give them more to do, because this is a strength. This may be a gifting of my child and something that we want to see them develop further, because this is how they are naturally inclined. But on the flip side, we may have some things that students are not doing as well in. And at that point, we can say, great, this is really helpful information, because now I know that we need to change something up with the way that we are doing instruction in this area. That may be curriculum, but it may not be as extreme as that. Maybe it's just revisiting some concepts that you thought they had that maybe, are not as solidified as you thought. So look at what kinds of results and analytics you're going to get, and are those going to be really useful? Okay, so I know everybody's always concerned about college entrance exam testing, right? So we have to go there. I wanted to define a few terms first, because this is, like I mentioned at the beginning, test optional changed a lot of things, and that term gets thrown around a lot. Not everybody knows exactly what all the test terms are and how they interplay with college admissions. So when we talk about test blind, there are a few schools in California particularly that have gone test blind. There are not very many schools that have done this. So just be aware, you don't hear this one very often, but it's sometimes I see people conflating this with test optional. But test blind means that no scores will be considered. They absolutely cannot consider them. They won't look at them. They are not a factor in admissions at all. So as I said, pretty rare, not going to see this one too often. I think it's, like I said, mostly there's a few schools in California that have done this. Test flexible is a term that really came into play a lot during COVID. You don't have an ACT score that we normally require. Okay, but you've taken some of these other tests that I think we can see how you're performing giving those. So, so we can look at a different test instead of the one that we normally require. So with test flexible, CLT saw a lot of acceptance because we were still testing during COVID. We rolled out remote proctoring. And so schools that still wanted some sort of test score were like, oh, we've never really considered the CLT before, but we're going to take it because, we're going to be flexible with what a student could submit during the time that testing was shut down for about a year. But test optional. So test optional actually means students may choose whether or not to submit scores. It also means, supposedly, that you will not be penalized if you don't submit scores. And I say supposedly because I'm going to give you a few caveats here. There are some questions that you need to ask. And I put this in here because I see a lot of misinformation sometimes on some different homeschool groups about what it means to be test optional. And let me say this, different parts of the country have different levels of test optionalness among their colleges and universities. So I see a lot of people saying like, oh, you don't need a test at all. My kid got admitted to, 5 universities without ever taking a test, and they got scholarships and, all this. That may be true in some cases. In the South, and particularly the Southeast, we are relying a lot more on test scores for even state college admissions than a lot of other areas of the country are. So be aware of that. You need to be aware of what's happening around you. It is regionally based sometimes. And we're also seeing a reversal of a lot of test optional policies. I have looked at both MIT and Purdue, which have come back out, and those are high performing schools. Those are schools that have some pretty high requirements for admission. And they came out and they said, we found that a lot of kids have a 4.5 GPA. Like a lot of kids are coming in with a lot of really impressive credentials and they can get admitted, but they couldn't do the math that was required. And so now we're seeing students in these prestigious schools, even the flagship schools usually don't have remedial classes. So if you go to UT Knoxville and you can't do their level of math, there's not really a class to get you prepared for that level of math. And so if you have to be able to do what is required when you get there. So MIT and Purdue were saying, you know what, we thought we could do this on GPA and on essays and on a more holistic review, but we ended up admitting students that weren't ready for the level of coursework that we have here. And so I think that we're starting to see as students were admitted under some of these policies that some of those higher performing schools especially are finding that students were maybe not as ready as they anticipated by looking at their GPA. I think we all know GPA inflation is a big issue right now. So I just want you to be prepared as you go into this. My recommendation is take tests. Have them in your back pocket. You can determine whether or not to submit the scores, but if you go into it without any backup, you may get caught in a way that you have limited options. So just with the mindset of let's keep every conceivable option open, because that's the way that we maximize scholarship dollars and affordable cost for college and such as that. Like we want you to have every possible option open to you. So when you are thinking of applying test optional, there are questions that I think you should ask. One is, are policies different for homeschoolers? That's a big one. That one came up a lot during COVID, that they were like, well, mom gave those grades. We don't really know if those are legit grades or not. And so we're still going to require this for homeschoolers. So that's one question to ask. Are the same merit scholarships available to those who do and don't submit? This is another issue that we've seen. Some are saying you can get admitted, but we're not offering any scholarships. Others are saying you can get admitted and here are some scholarships, but this top tier of scholarships is only available to those who have test scores. Okay, so that's another situation. This is not true everywhere. There are places that you don't have to submit a test score and you get top scholarships. So these are just questions to ask. These are things that I'm telling you I'm seeing, we're witnessing, we're able to hear these things as we talk to different colleges in my role at CLT. So I just want you to be aware of them. Next one is a little tricky to ask, and they may or may not want to answer this. Is the acceptance percentage for students who don't submit scores comparable to those who do? So there are still schools that are saying that they are test optional, but they are kind of preferring students who submit scores because they're assuming if you're not submitting a score, it's probably because your score isn't very high. And so again, not the case at all schools. Please don't hear me say this, this is true across the board, but this is one question that you might ask that would help you get at that answer, right? Is my student going to be disadvantaged in some way if they don't submit a score? That doesn't mean that you shouldn't apply there if if your score is not commensurate with what they're asking for, but it's just one of those things that you should factor in. And then, does my state have scholarships that require a test score? I mentioned before, I'm in Tennessee. My kids did need an ACT or an SAT score in order to qualify for some state-based scholarships. They have since in Tennessee changed that a little bit so that if you have dual enrollment credits, a certain number of dual enrollment credits with a certain GPA, that's another way for homeschoolers to qualify for those exams or for those scholarships. But then there's the next level of scholarship in Tennessee, the General Assembly Merit, and that one you had to have a test score for that one. So we played the game. We did the ACT score. My kids all ended up at schools that took CLT, and that was what they used for admission and scholarships at their schools. But they played the game and got the ACT score so that they could get their state money. But then beyond admissions, I want you to know that there are a couple of things that should be considered. There are schools that have requirements for a specific major. So they may be test optional for many things, but if you are applying to engineering, nursing, education, some of these kinds of majors, they may require a test score for those in order to be directly admitted into that program. And we've seen some of this even because some states have requirements that colleges show that all of the people being admitted to their teachers education program at the state college have this level of test score. And so just make sure that you're not just looking at the college as a whole, but at specific major requirements. Is there a requirement for a test score for my student's major? And then the other thing that I think is a little underhanded sometimes is that schools are telling students, oh, you don't have to have a test to come here. Don't worry about it. We welcome everyone. You just need your GPA. Don't worry about the test. And then you get there and they sit you down and they give you a placement test because they won't schedule you for any classes until they see where you're landing. Now, personally, I would rather my kids get to practice a test that kind of has some high stakes to it before they have to go sit down and take it. And but in absence of a recognized exam that they're using for admission, they may be pushing you into doing a placement test. So your student is still going to be assessed. They're still going to have to take a test. They're just doing it without preparation or the advantage of maybe seeing what that test looks like beforehand. So none of this, by the way, is to disparage colleges that have any of these policies. This is simply for your benefit to say, I want you to be aware of what the different considerations are. And you should just keep these things in mind and ask the right questions. I'm all about asking questions. Which brings us to the next point. What questions do you have? I would love to answer questions for you guys. And and I will do my best and I'll tell you if I don't know the answer.
I think in general, so far, it looks like many of the active participants here today are parents of younger students trying to plan ahead, or just maybe even doing some, private things to try to figure out where their students are. So some of the things that you've spoken to are so helpful. Just lowering the expectation, the anxiety level. Love that. That can apply to all of us at any age when it
Yes.
comes to testing. I mean, some of us are very aware that some of our kids freak out when they have to take the driver's test, or whatever, but their life is full of testing and we don't have to make it such a big deal. So I so appreciate all that you've said. Um, as far as college preparation goes, it varies widely. We are always at HomeLife. We're happy to help, really talk about your student very specifically. But I love it that Kimberly has hit on all the different options, like all the states, even, all the different levels of what you might be planning for future, and just easing into that is so helpful. How can for specifically for families who are considering a classical education approach, maybe even in the high school years or going on, and I see a lot of information right now recently. Your CLT is trending in the news, and came across my BuzzFeed the other day. And so that's exciting to hear that there are some other options, and maybe even an online option to do that in the privacy of your own home and things like that. So how can people find you or find out more about CLT? Or and then I will, at the when this is live for YouTube purposes, we will also link some things for HomeLife Academy or for counselors at HomeLife Academy. But how can they learn more about, especially, it is new, it feels new to be able to take an exam online, not have to show up in person. Can you let us know what that is looking like as far as future trends go?
Yeah, so let me first say that CLT is the classic learning test. It is not just for students who are classically educated, though classically educated students will be very comfortable taking the exam. The classic in our name comes from the fact that we pull from classic texts. So a lot of homeschoolers are already reading these, right? Authors like C.S. Lewis. And, yeah, we throw in some Aristotle and people like that occasionally, but you don't have to study Latin. There's no assumption that you've been classically educated in order to take the CLT. But if you want to learn more about us, cltaccommodations.com is the website. And I will just quickly tell you, we do have a college entrance exam for 11th and 12th graders. A CLT 10, there is a scholarship opportunity tied with this for 10th graders, but 9th and 10th graders can take this one. CLT 8, 7th and 8th grade, all of these are given at home online. For the CLT 8 and the CLT 10, parents proctor that one for their students. The CLT, or college entrance exam, we did roll out remote proctoring during COVID, and we are continuing with that because a lot of students can sit at home and take the test in their bedroom, and we use a camera. So we are remotely proctoring that one. But then that is all kept in-house. That's on our own platform. We're not using outside platforms to do that. So it is very secure. We are in the process of developing the CLT 3 through 6. I mentioned that earlier. We are pilot testing that right now, and that should be available by next spring 2024, and we can hopefully have just a great exam. If you want to look at that, especially you said if you've got a lot of younger students, I am so excited for this. I wish this was around when my kids were younger because I was struggling through, like, I don't care about this and I don't care about that, but this is stuff that, like, everything on here I would have cared about. So there is this sample test out here and I love it. Like, you're talking about authors like A.A. Milne and E.B. White and fables and fairy tales, and the nonfiction passages are biographies of famous people or about famous works of art or music. There's all this like richness in the history and the stuff that we're focusing on. It's I think it's stuff that most homeschoolers would be really confident having their students read. And then the math is, there's some straight computation, but there's also kind of that reasoning and logic side. It's one of the things that CLT has done all along, is that we've really wanted to look at the reasoning and the logic, because we don't, education is not complete if you can't apply the knowledge and think critically through what you are reading. And so that's a component of every CLT exam. And I think it's one of the really helpful things that we do. Then CLT's mission is to reconnect knowledge and virtue. And so the things that are on our exam are going to have things that should be discussion worthy, right? They should be things that you would want to talk about later. And I think especially in the younger grades, we want to make sure that what we're showing our kids is wholesome and it is edifying to them. And so we're not coming from a particular viewpoint, but we are just wanting to make sure that those things that everyone could agree upon as virtues are, are upheld in what we are presenting to students. So check out the sample test. It is really beautiful and fun. And there's a content framework. So this is really fun. I'm really excited for the possibilities as we go forward with that. But if you want to look at our CLT 8 for 7th and 8th graders, that's something we're going to administer that one May 9th through 11th. CLT 10 is April 18th and 19th. And then our CLTs, we offer about one a month. So there's lots of opportunity for students to get that college entrance exam in. And then, they can take it again, if they don't get the score that they need the first time. So I encourage you, just check out our website. You'll find lots of information there. And there are practice tests for the high school level test. There are practice tests when they create an account.
Great. Thank you so much, Kimberly, for being here with us today. If anyone who has additional questions, especially for those younger grade students, Beth at HomeLife Academy is happy to help. You can set up an appointment with her. She's happy to just individualize it as much as possible. Also for accommodations for high school students, if it comes down to a special needs situation or learning disability, and you have, your student still might need some of that kind of help. Beth is also happy to help with that. She has a lot of insight into that whole world. And so let us know, or, reach out to her, Beth at HomeLifeAcademy.com, and she is happy to help. So I think that covers all of the main questions for now, but thank you so much, Kimberly, for joining with us and partnering with us in this. It's been so helpful just to think it through and see it through the lens that pressure's off. It doesn't have to be a high anxiety experience for us or for our kids. And that is great. Love that approach.
Yeah, I don't think that I have the ability to communicate with everyone in the chat. It looks like I can only talk to hosts and panelists. So I'm not sure. I was going to put a couple of email addresses in.
Okay.
And so maybe I can read them off to you and you can type them in the chat maybe for
So,
everyone.
well, in general, what we do typically when we put this live, we'll include whatever other bonus sort of material you want to include, and we can do that. But yeah, sure. I can just type fast while you speak, and I am happy to do that.
So for people who have general customer service type questions about CLT, you can reach us at info at cltaccommodations.com. And I do see some questions about accommodations. That we do have accommodations. I want to let families know that up through the middle school years, up through 8th grade, families can administer accommodations as recommended by their evaluator, or whatever that process looks like is necessary. Once you get to high school, you do have to be formally approved for accommodations at CLT. That's a pretty standard process with most testing. You'll find that true kind of across the board. If you have specific CLT accommodations questions, those can go to cltaccommodations at cltexam.com. But again, for those like what will be the 3rd grade through the 8th grade test, those can be administered as you would normally do in your educational environment. So yeah, exactly. And then I think that pretty much covers it. HomeLife does have a discount code that all HomeLife families can use if they purchase any CLT exams. And that is HLA 2023. And that'll give you 25% off any CLT exam. So HLA 2023.
That's great. Thank you. So, and then for future reference, this webinar will be available on YouTube in usually about a week's time or so. They'll edit a little bit and cut out, or maybe break it down into 2 components. Sometimes they'll do that just for ease of accessibility and specifics. But thank you. So we'll let you know. I think they'll push out, a reminder when those are live, and they will be on the Home Life Academy YouTube page in the next few days. And so if someone missed out, or if you want to see the recording, it's great. We can have that available to all of you. All right.
Well, thanks so much for having me today, and happy to answer questions. If anybody has any, you can always reach out to CLT, and we're here to help you guys.
All right. Thanks so much, Kimberly.
Bye.
Bye.